Hey everybody, I'm Conscious Medium Brandon Ross, and welcome to Stream of Consciousness. Today we're going to be talking about the 1987 shuttle disaster when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded 73 seconds after liftoff. It took off on January 28th at 11:38 a.m. local time in Cape Canaveral, Florida, and it carried the first teacher to go to space. Well, what we're going to pick apart today is the astrology of the day. We're also going to honor the teacher, Christa McAulliffe, and the entire program. It's a really interesting take on a lot of different things here, and I don't think you guys are going to see this one coming. So stay tuned for this stream of consciousness, the 1986 Challenger disaster. All right, everybody, thanks for sticking around. Before we get started, make sure you like and subscribe, and also take a look at the class that I have available below. Chances are there's a discount available, but you probably got to sign up quick, like say an astrology class, like say for relationships or understanding your career. All right, guys, so listen, the Space Shuttle disaster, I'm going to actually give this as a little bit of homage, because in 1986, I remember sitting in the basement of a cafeteria parochial school with the rollout TV, and we all gathered around as a school to watch the space shuttle launch. Well, our eyes were always looking up to the stars, and even when I was just a bit of a junior astrologer myself back in the day, I always thought that I would go to the stars. I was always drawn to them. I was always fascinated by it, and for hours on end, I would just stare at the moon, not the sun. Anyways, that's something different. But in our school, we actually had someone that had been interviewed to become a finalist as a teacher. Now, a science teacher at a parochial school trying to be the first teacher in space, she was enamored by it. And quite frankly, she inspired all of us. So this is absolutely a salute to Mrs. Harris, to whom she taught countless kids at the St. Agnes Middle School, who inspired us, who dreamed, who told us all about what it was like to go to space. And I still today remember her words to say, I might not make it, but I've got to try and I got to keep going. She was eventually eliminated because of her glasses. She had to wear prescription glasses, and astronauts cannot wear contacts in space. So that's why she wasn't able to move on with that. But she kept us up to date with all of this. So as a school, we gathered in the basement, and to our dismay, 73 seconds in, seeing the explosion happen in this giant wide thing as she's instructing us, now there's going to be a huge plume, and what's going to happen is the booster rockets are going to push it forward, and she's imagining that she was on this flight. And then we heard the words, oh no, this can't be happening. All of the eyes turned to Mrs. Harris and thought, thank goodness she's in this basement with us because she's safe. We didn't fully understand what was going on at the time, but I think the adults in the room kind of knew this wasn't normal. We all got whisked away. We went back to our class and we said, wow, we saw a space shuttle. But a few of us sat there and went, that doesn't look good. Well, what I'm about to tell you, astrologically, is a story of fate. It's a story of whistleblowers. It's about destiny, and it's about what happened on that day. I want to bring up a very important person by the name of Roger. No, I'm going to pull up his picture first. Roger Beaujolais. Now, he was an engineer and he worked for the Jet Propulsion Lab, and he had seen the many failures that the shuttle program had been facing with the O-rings. And as many of you know, the shuttle disaster happened because the O-rings split apart allowed too much oxygenation in, and lit the entire tank on fire, which is the explosion that we saw. For days and weeks beforehand, Roger was screaming from the rooftops to delay this indefinitely. Well, in 1985, Ronald Reagan announced the Teacher to Space program. By the way, that's the one that Mrs. Harris and then ultimately Christa McAulliffe joined and successfully was named. But Roger Boisjoly was all about the science. He started to yell from the rooftops about how it was dangerous to even continue this program until this problem was fixed. Not only was it a known problem, but the tests were horrible. It was a 50-50 shot to actually get the shuttle off the ground. That's how bad the numbers were. I just want to show his chart here for a second because I want to set a primer. He has two very important things leading up to this day. I want you to pay attention to the North Node in Taurus that is in line with his sun. Now, this is causing him to be intuitive. This is also causing him to be faithful. And he was going to be attached to this day simply because of his chart. Now, the rising sign was Taurus on this day. This is incredibly significant. He was the North Node. He was the one saying we need to do better, and he was in alignment with it. So the North Node and the ascending were in conjunction here over his sun, his meaning, his purpose, his everything. Now, his rising was actually in Leo, which is a pretty good combination for an engineer. He's Taurus, he's practical, he's got stuff down, he's the way he's got to be. And then his rising is Leo, like I'm going to push forward, I'm going to be successful. All these things are actually really positive. And right next to the sun, sitting right here in the 10th house, is Mercury. That happens to be sitting right next to it, but in Aries. He was adamant that the space shuttle needed to be grounded. Did they listen to him? Obviously not. He also has a very interesting conjunct where, first of all, the sun is in square to him right here. So this is an action code. When the sun squares with itself, it typically means that, oh no, you've got to really pay attention to this. Now his angles are obviously a little bit off where it's, 8 degrees to 4 degrees, but this would still be considered a true square. So he has this Aquarian, the greater good of the energy of the day, influencing his Taurus to do the right thing. In the 10th house. Come on, guys. By the way, it was sitting in his 7th house, which means that it's all about relationships. He might have been caring about the science of it, but he was also caring about the crew. This was a really important thing as the space shuttle, Challenger, was delayed 3 times. And by the way, 3 times changed in astrology. Of course, a lot of people, and again, you've got to stay tuned to the end of this to see the entire conversation here. So with that in mind, I want to pull up young Christa McAulliffe. Christa McAulliffe was a teacher. She was out of the Boston area, and she was one of the first to actually apply. She was actually one of the first people to actually have her information. She went through the interview status. She went through all of the, I don't know why I'm showing you her chart yet. How about if I show you her picture first? How about her picture first? Do I not have her picture? That would be wrong. There she is. And by the way, her sitting here holding the space shuttle was the picture that we had in our classroom. That Mrs. Harris was like, this is the person that replaced me. And it was kind of a joke. Yeah, I kind of had a crush on her. But Christa McAulliffe became the education mantra for teachers to talk about space travel. She was able to talk about terraforms and what was on other planets and what was on the moon and what it was we were doing. She wasn't scheduled to do a spacewalk. She wasn't scheduled to do anything really all that important aside from observations and classroom-style teaching that we were going to have the opportunity to connect with in this Teacher to Space program. As a small parochial school, Mrs. Harris brought us into the 20th century. Because as you can imagine, most Catholic schools, parochial schools, don't have a whole lot of resources. And Mrs. Harris somehow made it all happen. Yeah. So Christa McAulliffe went through all of these tests. She, most importantly, not only had the credentials and the education, but then she also had the physical endurance in order to travel into space. That was a very key thing to this. Now, that being said, Christa, now let me pull up her chart again. Christa has some very interesting things about her chart. And before I point out anything about the actual shuttle disaster, pay attention to the inside track of this. You have, on the inside track of this is her natal chart. She's a Virgo. She was born on a new moon, right? She's born on a new moon. Her moon and her sun are conjunct in the 5th house in Virgo. That's a very important thing. And of course, Virgo energy is all about that. It is all about being able to do the task and do the right thing and fulfill it and almost be obsessed a little bit to get it right. She, with creativity. She's a great teacher for this reason. She's an even better astronaut. Now, her rising is in Taurus. Oh, didn't we hear Taurus here just a few minutes ago? Her rising in Taurus is incredibly important. Now, let's take a look at the outer wheel. There are a couple of very important things to this. First of all, on a personal level, in her chart, in the 6th house, is Saturn and Mars. Well, Saturn is kind of the great structure. This is about friendship, this is about destiny, but it's moving through Sagittarius. Hold on a second. We're going to hang on to that notion throughout the rest of this video. You also have Mars in opposition to her Lilith. This is a time of pain, quite frankly. This is a time of self-realization. And the fact that Lilith is in the 12th house, it's the house of the undoing, and Mars being in the 7th house is and on that cusp of the 6th house is a true to form personal challenge time. And personal challenge with the people around you, challenges within your own growth and learning. Now, in the 6th house, there is Pluto and the South Node in conjunct in Scorpio. We're about to uncover the challenges of everything that's going on around her. The 6th house is the health and wellness, but it's also about frenemies. It's also about making sure that the things around you are good. Well, the South Node is kind of, in being in Scorpio, is really talking about uncovering the truth. Let's take a look at her North Node. Let's take a look at the North Node at this time. Well, the North Node actually is resting right over the top of Christa McAulliffe North Node. Hope you guys are paying attention here. By the way, I want to honor Christa here by moving her in front of me here. So with that in mind, it's funny, it's right here. I'm going to move her over here. Hey, there you go, Christa. So Christa, on this day, in this moment, has her North Node over her North Node in Taurus. Everybody, I want to mention that this is about destiny. Being in the 12th house is the unknown house. The house of hopes and dreams and ruin and disaster. She literally has a ruin disaster code in her chart. But I have to tell you, she passed doing what she loves. It was a new moon or it wasn't necessarily a new moon, but it was in Virgo. That Virgo moon moving over her moon and sun was her being completely blissful. And her saying, sitting in the 5th house, which is a little bit of charge and a little bit of rebellion and a little bit of everything. She was in the right place at the right time. It was just the wrong time in the universe. These placements actually put her in a position to be in peril. That is how she ended up on this space shuttle Challenger disaster. But let me tell you the story about another astronaut. This one is of Barbara Morgan. Barbara Morgan was also a finalist. I'll just put her right on my face. There you go. Don't cover this. Barbara Morgan was also a finalist in this Teacher to Space program. She was considered the backup. Well, the backup on this day has some incredible things on her chart. What I'm about to tell you, you can only explain through astrology. Just imagine what it was like for Roger Beaujolais to see this O-ring break apart and explode after he yelled from the rooftops to not let it launch. Now think about Barbara Morgan, who was one sniffle away from being the replacement for Christa McAulliffe and being in that cockpit when it exploded. Barbara Morgan is an agent of fate, because I'm about to show you her chart. And as I bring this up, I say this in all due respect. We are a creature of who we are. And if astrology plays us right, we are absolutely going to be in the right place at the right time. The first focus here for her chart, Barbara's chart, is also look at the similarities between hers and Christa McAuliffe's chart. I'll just point them out. They were both born on a new moon. That's significant. In other words, they're both pioneers. So they have that as something in true to form. Second, they also have their moons, having that conjunction. Pay attention that it moved into the 6th house for her on the day of that disaster. In other words, somebody was watching over them. She naturally had the South Node in Virgo and Pluto in a very wide conjunct here. They're not really conjunct, but they're in the 6th house. And what that means is that she has power to be comfortable in her own shoes and to do the right thing. Those two combinations are incredibly important. Well, she's very busy in the 7th house, which is about relationships and friendships. And she's got Neptune in there. So she has Neptune and Venus in conjunction. But also pay attention to 2 other planets. She has an opposition in the 7th house, Saturn, and in the 1st house, Jupiter. 1st house, Jupiter, is an expansion of self that you are going to, in no way, shape, or form, at all costs, you're going to expand. You're going to grow. That is a really positive thing. Now, let's take a look at what's going on with her on the actual shuttle disaster time. I want to point out 2 particular things. The first thing is, take a look at where Saturn is. Saturn is in the 9th house, and it's over her sun, essentially. It is in conjunct with her sun. This, of course, and again, being in the 9th house, which is very, very important. In the 9th house is about education. It's about travel, right? When Saturn gets conjunct with your sun, it's about culminating all of your goals. It's about understanding where you're at. And it's about taking everything that you know and having a little bit of ego and identity and everything else. But wait, there's more. So for her, this would have been a great day just on that aspect. But where did fate come in? Fate came in because the North Node is in the 1st house for her. It's not in the 12th house. It is conjunct with the rising of the day in Taurus. It is her putting her first. So those 2 combinations are about that. The sun was also in conjunct with, and again, during Aquarius, which is also a very interesting thing, was in a wide conjunct between Venus and Mercury and the sun. This was in the 11th house, and this was about fate of the people around her, not her. Because only in the 6th house was her emotional value, her moon in Virgo. What's also interesting about this too is that, things such as her Chiron was at the furthest away from the sun. She was not in a position to be in healing mode per se. She also has in her chart this part about that moon and sun conjunction in 2 different houses. Her emotions are going to be felt through other people. sitting in the 8th house. But the key element to this is Saturn sitting over her sun in the 9th house. Well, tell you the rest of the story about Barbara Morgan. Barbara Morgan, shaken as she was, stayed with the program. It took her 21 years later to eventually go to space. And she then became the first teacher in space. It wasn't until 2007 when she was on the Space Shuttle Endeavor. Quite a bit of time in between. But let's look at the chart and explain why it is that this could have been the time. I clearly had this backwards. This was the time for her to be on that shuttle. Now, the inner wheel isn't going to change from the other chart. However, the outside is the timing of 12 years later. First of all, she went on August 8th, which is known as the Lion's Gate. The Lion's Gate is a portal time for interdimensional flight beings and everything in between. It is one of the great escape routes, if you will. If you want to transition, it is also a great time to connect. I'm here to tell you that Barbara Morgan was at the corner of fate and destiny. Because take a look at where her sun is in her natal chart. Again, sitting in the 9th house. Look at what she's in conjunct with here. Jupiter. And guess what? Jupiter over your sun in the 9th house is an educational blessing in disguise, a travel blessing in disguise. This was a fateful time for her, that this was the good fortune that she would have. Barbara went on to become an educator. She went and taught at the University of Idaho, which was nearby where she grew up and was a teacher out of, which was Montana, I believe. But she was right on the border of Idaho and had ties to it. After she retired, she became an astronaut educator, if you will. But if you look at her chart, she has two things that really stick out. And her fate was destined on this day. Not only did she have Jupiter in conjunction to her sun, but take a look at the 12th house. In the 12th house, in the natural setting of Pisces, the north nodes are in conjunction. Where Christa McAulliffe was about the squiggliness of the 12th house, where unexpected disasters could happen, magical existence can happen as well in the 12th house. In her destiny, with this Pisces connection, by the way, in conjunction with good old Uranus, allowed her to ride that wave. Now, an astrologer could look at this and think that, well, there's a possibility of disaster. Well, or the possibility of such great success that you wouldn't even know what to do. Now, her 7th house being open with Lilith there in the 29th degree in the Anarach part of that brought great healing to her, the dark energy, the loss and the fear. And guess what? In the 7th house, go ahead and take a look at it. Lilith at the 29 angle with Lilith in Libra allows her to heal with balance. That's when her heart was sealed. That's when her heart was healed. Also take a look into the 6th house, where similar position of the nodes on those days, for her, it was about practicality and dreams. She was also Saturn is sitting there in the 6th house, which means that the stability had come to everything around her. And of course, the sun conjunct to Mercury. It's not really, though. But the proximity of it, where the sun sitting in the 6th house, but then Mercury sitting in the 5th house for her, right here, was her way of carrying the torch for Christa McAulliffe. She was using her voice in an homage to remember all of the activity of Christa McAuliffe's 5th house. Her 5th house had so much involved in it, it lined up very near to her Mercury. I'm going to go ahead and show this and make myself a little minimized. So by taking a look at Barbara in the Endeavor, she's at the 29 angle with Mercury in the 5th house. Look at the 29th angle of Mercury in the 5th house. Listen, I'm going to put them right on top of each other here so you can see it. The Mercury 9th house, right, in the 5th house, this is just incredible to me, right? I'm sorry, it's at the 8-degree angle, not the 28th angle. I got that mixed up. But the fact that Christa's angle was 29 means that that's the point of emphasis. Now, you can only imagine that Christa McAulliffe and Barbara Morgan became good friends throughout all of this, right? And again, as a team player, and by the way, Barbara is 100% a team player based on her chart. She's got way too much stuff in the 7th house to be jealous. She's about cheering on other women, quite frankly. So of course she's not going to be jealous about this. But I'm gonna say this as plain of English so that then this point is clear. Barbara Morgan paid homage to Christa McAulliffe in her chart because literally the Mercury, which is the voice, which is the action, lines up almost near perfect to this. Sitting in the 5th house as it was in her house, acknowledging the fact that Christa's was at the 29th angle, saying, if I don't make it, somebody else has to. And guess what? Barbara Morgan made it. This is one of those charts that as you look at it, and as you grow with astrology, and you start to look at things, you end up pouring yourself into things that you never thought you would. Just want to honor Christa here as well. I'll have them both up here. But as you dive into astrology and you begin to do comparison charts and synastry and transits and that sort of thing, when I remembered my own stories about Mrs. Harris in the basement and watching the shuttle disaster and watching all these kids looking at Mrs. Harris going, oh my gosh, I think of these two women. And I think about how we talk about lifting other women up. I just gave you that prime example to it. This story actually has everything. It has the want and the will to expand who we are as civilization into the Aquarian age. It has the idea that there will still be missions and people that will be driven, but then other people that need to kind of keep us in check so that then we're all safe. That's Roger Beaujolais. But when you talk about the fate of Christa McAulliffe on that day in the North Node lighting up the way that it did, in the position that it did, with the stressors and the actions in place, Christa McAulliffe became a pioneer of a different kind. Then for Barbara Morgan to pick up the wand and think about it 21 years later. By the way, what is 21 in tarot but the full cycle? She had to wait one full cycle, and by the way, the planets aligned, and she carried the torch. We talk about women building up women, and some of it's about a you go girl and shine your tiara and all that other good stuff, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But to watch what these two women did for one another, to have their back, is pretty incredible. Christa McAulliffe torch was carried by Barbara Morgan astrologically. And she made sure that someone like me would see it. I want to thank you guys for joining me for this very special stream of consciousness. I want to give you guys a heart tap to remind you to simply care and love for one another and just simply keep going. I'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks again to all my supporters.